Depending on where you are seated, where you are listening to us today, good morning, good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this workshop presented by Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand on forced marriage and Australian study. To begin our time together, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we're meeting on. We honour their traditions and custodianship as being the oldest culture in the world. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any elders that may be present with us today. My name is Gendry Klein-Brettler and I'm the Mission Director at Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand, and I'll be facilitating the session today. Every year, millions of girls across every country around the world are married as children. Today, we are sharing the cultural, emotional and physical impacts of forced marriage within the Australian context. Australia's experience may be very different from the country and community you are based in. So I just ask you that during this session, if you have a pen and paper with you, perhaps as you're listening, note down any similarities you are hearing to your experience and what is different for your community or country, and any questions that might arise for you, because we'll be able to chat about that at the end of the session where there'll be some time to share. If you happen to be with us on YouTube, please place a comment or a question in the chat box and we'll look out for that and also try and include you in the conversation. I would now like to introduce you to Laura Vidal, who is the Head of Social Policy at Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand. Today, Laura will share with you insights into the circumstances and impacts of forced marriage from an Australian perspective. I'll hand over to you and thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Gendry. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So as Gendry said, I'm Laura, and today I'm going to walk through understanding and responding to forced marriage within the Australian context. And the Australian context with respect to forced marriage is actually quite unique, as it's one of the only countries in the world that explicitly defines forced marriage as a practice of modern slavery. So it has a particular legal context in Australia. And as Gendry prefaced, the way in which we understand, or the way in which young women experience forced marriage in Australia, is quite distinct compared to other parts of the world, given our high migration rates and our diverse population. So I'm going to, I guess, walk through some of those elements today. I come to this work from a direct practice background. So I've spent over a decade working directly with young women who have been at risk of or who have entered into forced marriages or marriages without consent or underage marriages. And the work that I'll be sharing with you today is a combination of practice insights as well as multi-country research study that I conducted in 2017 and ongoing policy analysis that I now do as part of the work that we do at Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand. So when we think about forced marriage in Australia, it has a very particular legal definition, and that is a definition which really is ultimately about a marriage being entered into without free and full consent because of the use of coercion, threats, or deception. We see it as something that's typically arranged by others against the will of one or both parties. And our experience also is that there is high degrees of pressure from family members who then may be experiencing pressure from broader community members about upholding particular norms within their community. And sometimes it can be defined through a religious lens, a cultural lens, but more and more what we're finding is that it's really about social normative behaviour as opposed to anything that may be explicitly linked to religion or culture. They're absolutely features that need to be understood, but the way I have really come to understand it is really about social norms and behaviours. In Australia, we very much, from a legal perspective, distinguish between an arranged and a forced marriage. So arranged marriages, unlike forced marriages, are not against the law in Australia. And what I guess the defining feature from a legal perspective is really an arranged marriage requires consent, whereas a forced marriage is one that happens without consent. Practice tells us that is a very, very grey area, and it's not quite as clear cut as the law would like us to be. But for the purposes of this presentation, and I guess for really understanding that Australian context, it's important for me to note that there is a clear distinction between an arranged and a forced marriage. So Australia defines forced marriage as part of our offences on modern slavery in our national criminal code. However, in addition to understanding forced marriage as a practice of slavery, there is increasing recognition across the country around how forced marriage intersects with other forms of gender-based violence, particularly family violence and sexual assault, as well as child abuse and neglect. One state in Australia has defined forced marriage within the context of family violence. It is included in our National Action Plan to reduce violence against women and their children. But in terms of its explicit legal response, it is still very much defined within the framework of slavery. And I'm going to talk about some research that I did in 2017 that really interrogated that framing to understand whether or not people feel like that's an accurate reflection of the experience. The response to forced marriage in Australia as a result of that framing is still very much emerging, particularly within recognising it, broadly within the gender-based violence context. We know very, very little about forced marriage in Australia, despite what would be considered a considerable response. And we know little because it is an issue that is very much underreported, and it's underreported for what we would consider very significant reasons, such as the people that may be posing the greatest risk to the young person is their family. And so they are very hesitant to report their family members to law enforcement, for example. And the most common thing that I hear and have heard from young people is, we don't want anybody to get in trouble, we just don't want to get married. And so as a result of that particular dynamic, we see significant numbers of underreporting. And what we do understand about forced marriage in Australia really comes from a set of people who have been prepared to report or disclose their circumstances to authorities. So from what we know currently, since Australia formally recognised forced marriage as a crime in 2013, there's been 300, sort of between 300 and 400 now. The last official reporting numbers were 325 referrals to the Australian Federal Police. It mostly involves females under the age of 18 years. 43% of all referrals related to trafficking and slavery currently recorded in Australia relate to forced marriage incidences. And for the most part, it involves Australian citizens taken overseas for the purposes of marriage. And with that, I'll provide the caveat that what we are seeing is, whilst people are Australian citizens, they may be second or third generation migrants to Australia. So they are people who are kind of what I have always observed to be living between two worlds almost, where they may have been born and raised in Australia, but they live in a community that is diverse, and they're trying to navigate and negotiate two identities: the identity that they have by growing up in Australia and going to school in Australia and seeing what the possibilities are, and then having some fairly specific expectations placed on them by their families and communities. Just sort of back on the numbers, it's important that we also don't understand reporting data as prevalence data. So just because we know about 300 to 400 people since 2013, that's not a prevalence number. It's really just the number of people that have reported. And a big drive within the Australian context right now is about additional research that's required to really understand this issue as it presents in Australia. What we do see in terms of what drives or influences the practice of forced marriage in Australia is quite diverse. And I have seen these issues sort of occurring along a continuum, for many people, and there are often different circumstances for each individual person. So we've seen situations where there is a clear migration benefit. So marrying somebody overseas in order to sponsor them to come back to Australia. Social or behavioural control. So might have a teenage daughter who's, maybe not behaving as I would like them to, and marriage will sort of bring them back into line and be able to subscribe to a particular societal or moral code. Peer and community pressure. This is the way it's always been done. We're here to continue on those long held and tightly held expectations and traditions. There is a lack of understanding about the laws in Australia and interpretations of rights and choices. There's financial gain that can be had, questions around sexual and gender orientation and the acceptance or non-acceptance of that, and then customary practices. So, that intergenerational expectation, which is quite gendered, I will say. In terms of indicators, I like to put this up here for anybody that might be watching around, who does this work or, may work in a school or may work in an environment where they're interacting with young women where that might be a risk. And indicators, this diagram comes from the Government of Scotland, and I like it a lot because it shows how all the different factors interrelate. So none of these things sort of stand alone that would give you a red flag to say this person is at risk of a forced marriage. But when you have more than one of these things all interacting together, it might pose you to ask that question about, what might be going on at home or what some of those expectations are. And some of those really common things happen in the sphere of education. So young people may be disengaging from school or not prioritizing, plans for after school. And in my work as a social worker, engaging directly with young people, most of the referrals that I had came via schools because schools were safe places. Young people had 6 hours a day in school without, family members or anybody surveilling them. And those disclosures would happen within that education environment. And teachers and other staff would also observe young people disengaging from that process with narratives like, it doesn't matter if I don't finish school because I'll be getting married anyway, or I'll never be allowed to go to university. This stuff doesn't matter to me. So, and then control around, extracurricular activities and ways in which people engage with their peers is a really clear picture. So I highlight that also because of Good Shepherd's, significant footprint globally around education, and that really having been our experience in Australia as a really safe place for young women in particular, and places where they do often disclose these concerns, and educators and school staff can play a really critical role in helping to provide a point of intervention. Key features of Australia's response to forced marriages, this is sort of where it gets unique in that it is heavily embedded within the criminal justice system. So it was criminalised in 2013, and our response to forced marriage is entirely reliant on a disclosure to federal law enforcement. So if you do not want to disclose to law enforcement, you also you're not eligible for referral into the government's funded support program. So we do have a national support program that's funded by the Australian government, but referral into that is via federal law enforcement. The interesting thing about Australia's law is also that the marriage doesn't have to take place in Australia for it to be considered an offence under Australian law. So if there is some connection to Australia and you return to Australia, people involved in facilitating that marriage can be liable under Australia's law for that. So that is a very interesting cross-territorial aspect of our legislation. any marriage under the age of 16 is automatically considered forced. This was a legislative change that came in 2018, where it means that any minor is considered unable to give consent, and as a result of that, it would be considered a forced marriage under our law. The law also recognises religious, cultural, and legal marriages. So the marriage in and of itself doesn't need to be a marriage registered under the law in Australia. So if it is recognised as a marriage within a religious or cultural context, and that was something that you did not consent to enter into, our law would extend to that particular circumstance as well. We at Good Shepherd understand forced marriage to be particularly gendered, and that there are expectations on women and girls that do not, are not in parallel to the expectations on men and boys, and that there are also gender hierarchies that begin from a very young age around the expectations around how women and girls will progress through their family structure or society on a whole. And there is growing recognition internationally that the experience of forced marriage is particularly gendered. The other gender dimensions of forced marriage is really about the disproportionate impact of marriage on young women, including what happens around sexual consent and also childbearing, because there are arguments that exist that if somebody does not consent to enter into a marriage, they then don't consent to engaging in an intimate relationship with that person, and then essentially don't consent to childbearing in that relationship either. So it has a ricochet effect, which can have detrimental both, social as well as health impacts on young women. We also see it as being part of, I guess, patriarchal structures that perpetuate gender inequality. So when women are forced into marriage, they are usually withdrawn from education or have limited employment opportunities, if at all. And so then women and girls' participation in society is, significantly hampered as a result of that. We also see the power, control, and coercion dynamic that exists in other forms of gender-based violence, as well as, family violence dynamics at large. That they are central to defining forced marriage, and as a result of that, really do sit within that broader dynamic of gender-based violence. So in 2019, Good Shepherd published an issues paper which looked at the response to forced marriage within the family or gender-based violence context in Australia, and I've put the link on the slide for anybody who's interested, and it does track international literature around those gender dimensions of forced marriage. So I thought, given Australia's unique context, it would be interesting to also look at the definition of forced marriage within the framework of slavery. And the kind of jury, the international jury, is out around its applicability in this context. And also, questioning around Australia's sort of move to do that, as opposed to placing it in any other dimension of our socio-legal framework. International legal precedent is kind of there. It doesn't apply very explicitly to forced marriage, but for the sake of the argument, it's important to note that the 1926 Slavery Convention and the 1956 Supplementary Convention does look at where forced marriage features, but it features in a very specific context, particularly around transfer of women between marriages and also financial exchange. And what we also understand is that not all forced marriages involve that particular dynamic, and they do involve much more heavily the gender dynamics around expectations on women and girls. The other thing that we do see often in forced marriage situations is a life of servitude that women will then experience as a result of that marriage. So that includes, conditions similar to slavery, such as exploitation, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, and, drawing a bit of a line there between that and forced labour. The research I conducted in 2017 in 6 countries, I asked very specific questions about, how women and girls themselves define forced marriage and what their sort of impressions are around it being defined as a practice of slavery, and also the implications of framing it that way as opposed to framing it within a broader gender-based violence discussion. And overwhelmingly, the research found that the framing of forced marriage as slavery was unhelpful to women and girls, that it had it created greater opportunities for barriers to engage their families and communities in conversations about behaviour change. The slavery framework didn't offer the very specific nature of gender that is important in understanding the dynamic of forced marriage. People were able to see the relationship, but also saw the missed opportunity that arose out of, the explicit recognition of the gender dynamic there. And that slavery doesn't naturally extend to threats or plans to facilitate a marriage without consent. And so it was important, or, a key finding of that research really was arising a number of questions and considerations that need to be made when we're thinking about things like forced and child marriage. Is how we define it really does matter when it comes to how women and girls are then able to access support and some kind of intervention. Some of the unintended consequences of Australia's response to forced marriage is really that explicit relationship between the criminal justice system and access to support, particularly because women and girls in Australia need to report to law enforcement in order to be offered that support, which makes it incredibly challenging for them to come forward. And then, if they don't come forward, there's not actually a funded support pathway. So questions and considerations around framing are really important because it has an impact on how people are then able to access their rights, essentially. The research really raised more questions than it did answers, but important questions for us all to be considering when grappling with policy and practical responses to responding to women and girls in this context, which really does lead to Good Shepherd's overall response to this issue in Australia, which is to have an intersectional approach to responding to forced marriage. Intersectional both on the basis of gender and gender expression, but also the variations that come within that for women who have diverse backgrounds, women who live with a disability. All of these things have to be considered because that context influences how people then engage with the systems that are or are not designed to help them. The other thing that needs to be recognised is the way in which forced marriage intersects with different types of criminal behaviours or other kinds of abuse and neglect, such as child abuse, sexual assault and rape, domestic and family violence, female genital mutilation, and human trafficking. And, at the heart of this, as I prefaced earlier, was really that power, control and coercion dynamic, which is really quite central to all of these different areas of exploitation. So really critical to any response to gender-based violence is to look at how all of these key issues interact and ensuring that our systems are designed and set up to be able to provide people what they need when they need it in the way in which they need it. So, the UN Secretary General's report on violence against women in 2006, even though it may be considered outdated now, it really does define gender-based violence in the most holistic way. And that really is about a continuum of multiple interrelated and sometimes reoccurring forms of violence. And forced marriage is no exception to that. The continuum of harms that are involved in a practice like this is something that really should be considered from multiple angles. And the work that I'm doing now, so the research that I'm currently involved in, is really attempting to understand that experience from the perspective of young women themselves, because the way in which forced marriage or child marriage can be framed globally as well as in the Australian context is to perceive the people who are engaging in this practice as, people who are breaking the law, or people who are intentionally setting out to take away the rights of their daughters or harm their daughters. And it's far more complex than that. And I think we have a responsibility to develop a nuanced understanding, to actively engage families and communities in the conversation and in that sort of social and behavioural norm change platform, because further ostracizing or vilifying people within their familial and community context is not a proven strategy to change behaviour or attitudes to things that may be harmful. And I think one of the learnings that I take away from the way in which we deal with this issue in Australia is really that are we able to effectively engage with people when the first line of defence is criminal law? And there's a big question mark over that, particularly for young women themselves who find it very hard to navigate that system. And as I opened with, are actively saying, I don't want anybody to get in trouble. I just don't want to get married. So, that kind of leads us to these ideas about what do we need to do or what comes next. And I think overall, Australia and, abroad, domestic violence, human rights and child protection frameworks need to recognise forced marriage, and they need to recognise it not just in a legal context, but within that community and family systems context. And then we need an integrated approach with a wide range of interventions that also gives young women, because what we also see is we are talking about young women in Australia, typically aged between 16 and 25. They are young women with decision-making capability. And under the law in Australia, once you're over the age of 16, you are over the age of consent. And so we need to be engaging young women in that decision-making process to ensure that our responses are meeting their needs and that are going the distance for changing intergenerational practices which may be considered harmful. And then, in addition to that, or what comes next logically after that, is increased legal redress and social protection and availability of resources, which are not contingent on participation in a particular process or framework which, young women themselves consider to be additionally harmful. So, we in Australia may appear on paper, I think, by international standards, to have a very strong approach to forced marriage, and that is not untrue. It is something that is completely not tolerated under the law, but it's something that next layer down that, us in the community doing this work are really grappling with the young women around how they navigate and negotiate their own rights in these circumstances. And that's where we're sort of at in our particular timeline of response, is sort of calling into question the ways these responses happen and calling into question whether or not we are meeting the needs of young women in the way they need their need, they need to have their needs met. So it's an interesting time, and there is lots to learn. And in fact, on the international stage, there are, active and ongoing conversations right now around what is necessary, which include things like, changing the minimum age of marriage in places where 18 is not considered, the legal age of marriage. And there's questions that are raised around the bright light of 18. And, do people's family and community contexts change when they turn 18? And our experience in Australia is that it doesn't change when they turn 18. So as a result of that, the frameworks need to apply whether the person is a child or an adult, because adults too need to be able to freely access support and intervention. So I think we've got great time for questions and engagement in terms of my presentation, but if there were specific things that people wanted to understand a little bit more about Australia's response to forced marriage, I'd like to open the floor to questions and discussion.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for really deeply unpacking the issues around forced marriage from our perspective, but also the deep insights into what girls are dealing with in relation to forced marriage. And as Laura said, we have opportunity for questions and discussion. And I just want to remind people on YouTube that you can participate by putting your question or your statement or response into the chat box, and we'll monitor that, and we will also include you in the conversation. Winifred, could I turn to you first? I think you may have had a question earlier on. It may have been answered, but you may still want to raise that, or anything else, actually.
Thank you, John-Dre, and thank you, Laura, for a very comprehensive presentation with regard to child early and forced marriage and how it's viewed in the Australian context. Yes, maybe you have answered it or not, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And that is like that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is international law, says 18 years, and that under 18 years, the person is considered a child. And therefore, like the safeguarding of children apply in that context. However, the Convention on the Rights of the Child doesn't explicitly deal with child early and forced marriage, while it recognises all of the consequences and the harmful effects on the child. It doesn't come out straight and say it's shouldn't be practiced. And I just found that interesting, given the context that you have presented, because my own experience of dealing with child early and forced marriage, which of course was in Ethiopia, was very much geared on educating the community. That's where we started. Now, it's very difficult to get the police there to take action or whatever. So it would be very much engaging parents, doing education with the parents, and preparing them for when, knowing this is a custom, and preparing them in their minds and changing their attitudes towards this practice. And what we would have found, I think, very much is that girls indeed were very grateful that we would take that stance in terms of education, because then it was easier for them to talk to their parents. Whereas if they're in a context where it's not brought up and not addressed, well, then the tradition continues. But if there is the kind of way of having education and saying, this is not right, this is not to be practiced, let us know if you're thinking that way. And girls would come forward looking for the help. And usually it was a matter of negotiating between the girl and her family and the boy's family, because very often it has to do with finance and economic security rather than looking at independence. My question around the CRC and the age. Thank you.
Yeah. So Australia, too, they are compliant with the CRC in terms of children are people who are under the age of 18. How it plays out in practice, though, is a little bit different depending which state you live in. So our child protection or safeguarding mechanisms are state responsibilities. So Australia being a federation, we've got federal laws which apply to everybody across the country, and then each state in Australia will then have state jurisdiction over particular parts of the law. So child protection sits within state jurisdiction, and depending what state you live in will depend on the child protection guidelines around when an intervention for child protection will kind of be activated. So, for example, I'm in Sydney, so in the state of New South Wales, and our child protection legislation in our state is that whilst people are considered a child, to the point that they're under the age of 18, when it comes to decision making or mandatory intervention, that doesn't occur if the young person is over the age of 16. So they will, for example, provide maybe light touch or referral type services in this situation, but they're not mandated, and nor can they mandate the adolescent to engage in any particular intervention when they're over the age of 16. So, for example, in situations of forced marriage, my casework experience was that if the person was, say, 17 or 16 and a half and disclosed forced marriage and home was no longer a safe place for them to be, it wouldn't necessarily trigger a child protection response because that young person can consent on their own accord to live outside of their family home. So they wouldn't need to engage the court system, for example, to remove that young person from their family home and place them in safe accommodation. So there's parts of the law that very much see children as anybody who's under the age of 18, and then other parts of the law that are 16 and above, pending particular sorts of circumstances. So the minimum age of marriage in Australia is 18. And up until we had a legislative change in 2018, the federal law that criminalised forced marriage had something called a rebuttable presumption in it, which effectively meant if you were over the age of 16, the defence could build a case to suggest that you did know that you were consenting to that marriage and you were able to be married. So now that rebuttable presumption has been removed, so there is a blanket offence for anybody under the age of 16 who is entered into a marriage is automatically considered forced because they cannot consent. But that bracket between 16 and 18 is something that's still, I guess, up for negotiation. The other aspect of our law, which is not commonly used, but is something to, note out of interest, is the Family Court or the Family Law Act, where the Marriage Act and the Family Law Act that work sort of together in respect to marriage, have a provision in there that if the person is under the age of 18 and over the age of 16 and they want to get married, permission can be sought from the court to grant permission to marry between the ages of 16 and 18. So with parental consent and a court order, technically the law will allow a marriage between 16 and 18 years. Incredibly difficult for the court to provide that order, given all of the challenges around consent and parental consent and coercion and things like that. It's not common, but the law has still not been, it hasn't come in concert with these other expectations or legislative parameters that we have around forced marriage and age. So it's a little bit of a patchwork quilt. In terms of your comment around education and behaviour change and engaging with families and communities, I think the most amount of evidence that we have internationally, be it in Western and non-Western contexts, is that actually respectfully and equally engaging communities in those conversations around behaviour change are the most proven mechanisms for supporting people to understand harm of the decisions that they're making in this context, but also looking at alternatives. So the research that I did in 2017 involved a case study in Kenya. And the work that they did in Kenya, it was UNICEF who led that work actually, who actually worked very closely with the community around both education with men and women and older people and younger people. And they did it in such a way where people, worked in their groups depending on their demographics. And then they slowly brought the community back together and were kind of contracting with each other around these expectations, so that the behaviour change happened in that whole community's population in parallel and then came together in unity. And that was a community then that essentially policed itself to say this is no longer a behaviour that we accept in our community, and there are new norms and standards around how we engage in marriage. And it was one of the most successful initiatives or programs that I had the opportunity to observe, because it really then had intergenerational implications, as opposed to what you've rightly identified, Winifred, that sort of police or law enforcement approach, sort of wagging their fingers saying this is not on, you don't do this, unless you actually invest the time in helping people to reframe where marriage sits in their social and cultural hierarchies. Then wagging your finger and saying you're not allowed to do this doesn't actually change the way in which people behave and interact, because it has implications, as you've rightfully identified, around economic security and place and structure. And unless you're able to address some of the things that people perceive marriage, or really, you know, marriage plays a role in facilitating some of these other safeguards, you know, in communities, unless you can address those things, people are going to continue to default to the thing that to them works. So I very much am, you know, in favor of approaches that really do invest in that behavior change that comes alongside kind of structural and societal norm change as well.
Thanks, Laura. I think that's, hopefully, Winifred, you can come back to us if you need to discuss more. I'm aware, Laura, that we've got some people from other culture and countries that may have something to contribute. I would like to ask Hilda if she would like to, Hilda's from India. I'd like to ask Hilda. Hilda, would you like to come into the conversation and perhaps share some of the insights you might have from your circumstance, and what might be somewhat different to what we're talking about or similar today?
January, I think Hilda has left.
She had to leave. Okay, all right then. Well, that's fine. Let's then maybe Maria from the Malaysia Sabah experience. You may be working in this area with some of your people. I'm not sure. Are you able to share?
No, I just want to share around my own community where I grew up, my own context in my own family and community. So I'm very much interested in the way that you, Laura, have explained, like Australia, where you are, you have been quite a number of policy and law in place. But in my case, I'm speaking about my own experience, where I see some of my nieces, nephews who will be entering into marriage before below 18. And one of the things that is challenges me as Good Shepherd, how to reach out in area this when they have the lady or the girl pregnant before the marriage, and somehow when the girl get pregnant, that's where I don't know whether it's considered categorized under forced marriage or arranged marriage. I'm not so sure, but I'm very much trying to understand the dynamic of the implication of when young people really the parents will get them to get married because they have a baby. So no matter how much we want to intervene or we want to do some counseling or try to let them see about what is the implication, I think it is very much related to the way our culture is really preventing the community to see beyond. So once you have a baby, whether you are under 18 or you're not ready, you have to just go into that marriage. And I would see that this is some of the challenges and problem that later on we can encounter, and that's where we try to find ways to help them. But I'm very much interested in what you are saying, that to reframe the mind around what is marriage. So I think for me, I begin to realize that I think this is what we need to do, I need to do, and educating my own family members, that it will take time, I guess, but I think it is really, we need to kind of, it take maybe one generation to two generations, but I think the education is important, because I have my own experience with my own nieces, nephew, or in the village, in the neighborhood. And sometimes when these things happen, we want to prevent them to get married. It is a lot of other implication that is coming into play. So I think it is good that if we are able to speak freely and to really bring this to more consciousness, and education is important. So I think it is very interesting to see how your side has been dealing with this. And where I come from, I think there is a lot more we need to do around this awareness and education, and not like you don't do this because if you get married, this it doesn't work. So I tried that with some people, but I think it's really putting me into more further away from them in reaching out. So I think I have learned that I think there is more need to be looked into when we are working with such cases or such situation around this marriage under 18 or even after 18 in the rural setting, when they are not really ready to be to live a marriage life, when economically they are not able to. So I think it's quite a number of things we need to consider and to look into. Yes, so I think that's a little bit of my experience in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up, I guess, maybe two things about what you were saying. The first being, like, in the Australian context, the laws around forced marriage, it doesn't matter if you're under 18 or over 18. If there's any degree of force or coercion or threats, our law will apply whether the person is a minor or an adult. So that last comment that you made there around, even people over 18 aren't ready for marriage, and there might be expectations coming from other places around complying with that. If that was to be the case in Australia and a young woman wanted to report that, then they wouldn't be excluded from a response because they're not a child. So that's, I guess, the way Australia has framed their response. The other kind of broad comments around people who may be pregnant out of wedlock and then a marriage is effectively arranged, that kind of speaks to the areas that I was talking about the reasons why a forced marriage may happen, and absolutely, pregnancy is one of those reasons, and families think that in some ways they can reestablish their you will probably resonate with this say, but like saving face. They've got a young person who's pregnant. They don't want anybody to know that their young person has potentially been doing things that in the moral code of society is not acceptable. And so in order to save face, getting married will make that a kind of a morally correct thing to do. And so this sort of falls into that category around sort of gendered expectations and moral codes and norms that, as a society, people expect things will happen in a certain way. And when they don't happen that way, there are certain things that will happen to try and right the wrong, if you will. And in a circumstance like you've described, like in the Australian context, if somebody was to come and disclose that they're having a baby and their parents are making them get married because of that, like that would, or almost always, kind of ordinarily fit the definition of a forced marriage in the Australian context. And it would really be up to that young person, dependent on age, assuming they're over 16, to be able to disclose and pursue an intervention away from that marriage. So that line between sort of arranged and forced marriage, if at any point the person who's expected to enter into that marriage says they don't want to get married, but they don't feel like they have a choice, or there's a consequence if they say no, then that would be considered a forced marriage under our definition in Australia, and in other parts around the world as well, who've applied a kind of criminal justice lens to this issue would certainly see those circumstances of, consequence or lack of choice would be, part of that dynamic of force. So that's, I guess, something to consider there. And then, what you've also raised is the very, tricky and deep work that needs to happen in communities, as you've rightly identified, to change, centuries of social and cultural normative behavior that, you're right, doesn't change overnight. And it is going to take generations of kind of standing up to those practices and kind of resisting them for them to change. So, for example, there's young women that I've worked with here in Australia who have resisted that practice, and the very kind of brave and courageous choices they make mean that they don't have relationships with their families now. But what they have reflected to me is that I can't control necessarily how other people respond to the decisions that I make, but I know that when I do have a family, this practice ends with me. And so, that is an incredibly, incredibly tall ask for a 16-year-old. And they're the kinds of decisions that these young women are making to end those practices, both for themselves and the young people that come after them. So it's a very, it adds to the layer of trauma that young people experience by, resisting that practice, in many circumstances being ostracized away from their families, rebuilding their lives, and then sort of carving the new way, which, is a lot to ask of a young person. So I guess I'm more of the view that we as a broader society within communities, not just outside of communities, but within communities, need to help carve that path out so that young women aren't having to be these brave kind of pioneers of a new world order. It's important to, have people like you, Maria, like having those small plant the seed conversations within your own family and community.
Thanks, Laura. Laura, there's a question in the chat box. I'll ask Alexis to ask you about what has influenced, or what were the forces that may have contributed to the laws that we have. Alexis, would you like to ask the question in your way?
Sure. So just listening to this, I think for me, thinking about the US context, which is similar to Australia, but very different in the sense, I think, of the 16 to 18 question mark period, we'll say, of allowing parental consent. And I feel like where we differ is we're not signed on to the CRC. So there's not really the international law to enforce that. There's only 2 states in the country that it is illegal for a child marriage to happen under 18. Everywhere else is kind of, there's questionable ages. But I don't feel that there's as much law around this or conversation happening in the way it seems that it is in Australia. So I'd just love to hear, obviously not the whole history, but just insight into how these conversations started and who was pushing them forward and things like that.
Yeah, I am quite familiar with the US context, particularly the age of marriage sort of debate. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Tahirih Justice Centre, but they are sort of leading the way on the forced marriage kind of legislative front in the US. And they're, in many states in the US doing that work, and they've got a very particular forced marriage initiative project. There's also another advocacy and campaigning organisation who has been doing kind of state by state legislative advocacy to raise the minimum age of marriage in many states across the US. So there is a pocket, I do know, of people in the states that are doing that very careful work. In Australia, look, people do ask me that question, like, how did you get to this point? And like, other types of law reform that I've been involved in, it's been kind of like years of haranguing and, strategic advocacy. With this particular offence, I almost feel like I woke up and the next day it was a law, and I kind of like took a step back and was like, I'm not really sure how that happened. But effectively, we had in 2010, there was a overall sort of review of Australia's modern slavery or human trafficking offences. And it was sort of looking at the whole spectrum of offences related to trafficking and slavery. And in particular, it was trying to identify situations of servitude. So we had many reports coming to federal law enforcement of servitude, where, you know, women were either coming to Australia married or getting married and then basically entering into a slave-like existence. And they were reporting to police, but we had no legislation that allowed the police to do anything about it, which made that, you know, quite problematic. So it was looking at servitude. It was looking at expanding definitions around forced labour and other kinds of exploitation. And my, you know, understanding and read of the situation is that I feel like, to a degree, the servitude and forced marriage components got a little bit conflated in the debate, and then it fell into the legislation sort of, you know, by osmosis, that, oh, we're addressing all of these issues, and, oh, of course it's not okay to be married without your consent, and, you know, kind of came into the mix with all of this other reform that was happening. And then it was only really after it was made a crime that people were like, well, how are we supposed to respond to this now? And then the responses kind of come after the legislative change, which, you know, in lots of policy contexts, the law is required as the impetus for creating kind of policy or programmatic intervention. But there's been sort of a mixed reception of the criminalisation of forced marriage in Australia because of some of those unintended consequences, and also the explicit linking between support and law enforcement. Like our family violence context in Australia, for example, you're not required to report to police in order to receive a social service, but in this context you are. And there's some real kind of, I think, human rights considerations around that, which are being, you know, have been called into questions from, you know, its inception. But, you know, it's a little bit problematic. But, you know, if this is something that you're interested in kind of delving a bit deeper, I'm happy to connect you with some of my colleagues that are in the US doing this work, because I'm sure they'd be really keen to share what they're doing and look at opportunities for collaboration. So feel free to drop me an email.
Thank you, Laura. That's a great question, Alexis, I mean, sorry. Teresa, have you also got anything to share on the broader Asia Pacific perspective, your involvement in looking into supporting many countries around very different issues? Do you have some things you'd like to share with the panel today?
Yes, thank you, Gendry. Just like to share a reaction or a comment in the YouTube comment section. Sister Shirani from Sri Lanka says that education is the channel which we can address the issue. We need to influence the decision-making body to take concrete and firm action to implement whatever laws that are in the country. And she also said that this crime is hidden so secretly in our society. And I think this would be relating to the society, the Sri Lankan society. So this is coming from Sister Shirani of Sri Lanka. Just like to add on to what Laura has been sharing about how behavior change is such a powerful tool. Just like to share that in Good Shepherd, we are seeing early marriage, and it's very difficult to say whether it's forced marriage, because in most circumstances where society is very patriarchal and is part of the culture and the religion to marry early, we are seeing in places like India, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, in Indonesia, this practice is very prevalent. And so within the Good Shepherd programs, almost all our programs with children today also deal with early marriage and the education of the family, the first level of care surrounding the child, the family, and then the society, and the community that surrounds them, to empower people on the difference between fully consenting adult marriage versus an early marriage, and all the effects that happens to the girl child, including mental health, physical health, education, and the implications to family and community over time. And very interestingly, in India, there are laws or there are incentives that you can avail of if the marriage of a particular person is above 18 years old. And our community mobilizers in all these places are educating the people in the communities how to access their rights if they are following a certain practice that the government is also encouraging. And many times people don't know that such laws exist, or such procedures and policies exist in these countries. Now, on the 20th of March, which is this Saturday, our group from Indonesia will also be presenting the girl child, issues affecting the girl child. And you will see a video that's coming out from Marau in Kalimantan, how the girls themselves are voicing out against early marriage, and what benefits it will have on them, their families, and society at large if this practice were to be reversed and reframed in a different way. So I just want to add on to this whole presentation today and appreciate this study that has come forward and has added value. And it seems like no matter which country we are from, there are parallels that we can draw from. There are behavior patterns, there are good practices that we can encourage in our respective countries. So just want to thank you for this presentation.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks for inviting us to be a part of it and to share this aspect of our work at Good Shepherd Australia, New Zealand.
Thanks, Teresa. We're coming close to the time that we have allocated for the session. I just wanted to check, was there any final comments or questions that that's rising in people's minds as we speak and as others are sharing?
I think I just want to affirm with this awareness education. I think it is more and more, I'm aware whenever I'm in my own context where encountering women and girls or working with the family and communities. So I think it is, for me, it is very much helpful for me to have this awareness and also listening from other people's experience, what works and what their challenges. So it is something that it gives me hopeful. I become very hopeful in order to really to speak up about this in a more respectful way, in a more energizing, engaging, rather than in the point of looking what is not right, but what is right. Yeah. So I think it is something that I'm very much happy where Good Shepherd around the world, we are together in this and we can learn from each other. So thank you very much for sharing your experience and knowledge.
Thanks, Maria. I think when we reflect back on this time together, one of the main learnings that seems to be coming through is this idea of having conversations. We need to talk, we need to check our mindsets, we need to ask questions, but it's not something that is easy to do. So it is, as you say, Maria, and I think from your sharing in your own community, and when we think of young girls and the age of them, it is something that we need to do together. It's not a lone voice approach because it's quite a sensitive area and it takes quite a bit of bravery to have these conversations. And we need to be able to stand by and support one another and support the young women. And so I just feel today we have just opened a bit further this conversation, and we have, it's a sign that we need to continue the conversation. So maybe one of the things we take away today is, maybe it's something to think about, is that we actually provide further opportunities, Teresa, for this topic, maybe within even Asia Pacific or broader, to have more conversation and to have more learning and to see where we can stand by each other. Obviously, we're at different places, politically, legally. The different countries have very different stances and are in a very different place. So I think the wisdom, Laura, that you've shared today, and that others, I want to thank the people in the group for sharing your wisdom, because it is the collective wisdom that will make the difference in the end. And you're right, Maria, we do need to learn from each other. So at this point, I would like to really thank you, Laura, so much for your time and your wisdom and the sharing and the insights, and for your ongoing work. It sounds like this is something that's very special to you, and you've obviously committed a fair bit of time to it. So we would like to thank you for your commitment to young women in these circumstances, and we hope we can hear from you again, and that maybe you can share more of your work, and that maybe some of your work will influence the broader community. So I'd like to thank everybody once again for joining us and for supporting this conversation. And I wish all of you a great day, and enjoy the other sessions that are coming along past us, beyond us. Thank you very much for coming today. And for all those on YouTube, thank you for listening and for contributing as well. It's been great to have you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jen.